Sarah Miller threw the return ticket into the dirt right there on the platform in front of Richard Cole, in front of the station master, in front of every single person in Clearwater, Wyoming, who had turned to watch the spectacle of a woman being sent back like damaged freight. Her hands were shaking. Her chest was on fire. But her chin did not drop an inch. "I didn't come 2,000 miles to be returned," she said, loud enough for all of them to hear. "And I will not be. If you've ever been thrown away by someone who didn't deserve you in the first place, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to know how far this story has traveled. This one is for every woman who ever stood alone in a strange place and decided to stay standing anyway." Let's begin. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Chicago. Sarah read it 4 times before she believed it was real. A ranch owner in Clearwater, Wyoming, by the name of Richard Cole, was seeking a wife. Reliable, hard-working, willing to build something from the ground up. He wasn't asking for beauty. He wasn't asking for charm. He was asking for a woman who understood that life on the frontier was honest labor and honest reward, and that was exactly the kind of life Sarah Miller had been trying to find since the day she buried her mother in a cemetery she could barely afford to maintain. She was 31 years old. She had worked 6 days a week at a textile mill since she was 16. She had nursed her mother through 3 winters of illness without once asking for help from anyone. She had saved every coin that didn't go toward rent or bread, and she had done it all without complaint, because complaint didn't put food on the table, and it didn't pay the landlord, and it didn't change a single hard fact about the life she was living. What she wanted, what she had wanted for longer than she could honestly remember, was land. Not luxury, not ease, just ground beneath her feet that belonged to her, a future she could see past the end of the month, and maybe if God was willing, someone beside her who understood what it meant to work for something and refused to let it go. Richard Cole's letter sounded like an answer. She wrote back the same evening. 3 weeks later, the arrangement was made. She sold her mother's brooch to a jeweler on Halsted Street and got less than it was worth, but she didn't argue. She sold her winter coat to the woman across the hall for $2. She gave up her room at the boarding house, packed everything that remained into a single trunk, and stood at the Chicago and Northwestern Railway station on a Tuesday morning in April, with a ticket to Wyoming, $23, in an envelope pinned inside her dress, and the particular stillness of a woman who has already made her decision and does not intend to revisit it. The train ride took 4 days. She did not sleep well. She ate sparingly. She watched the land change outside the window, the flat, dark farmland of Illinois giving way to the wide emptiness of Nebraska, the sky getting bigger and bigger until it felt like something that could swallow a person whole, and she told herself that this was the right thing. That a woman who was willing to work, willing to be honest, willing to show up every single day and do what needed doing, a woman like that deserved a place to belong. She arrived in Clearwater, Wyoming on a Saturday afternoon. The station was smaller than she expected. A wooden platform, a painted sign, 3 men sitting on a bench who looked up when the train slowed and then looked away again. She stepped down with her trunk and her envelope and her $23, and she straightened her dress, and she looked around for the man whose photograph she carried in her coat pocket. She recognized Richard Cole immediately. He was standing at the far end of the platform, exactly as he appeared in the photograph, tall, well-dressed for a rancher with the particular posture of a man who is accustomed to owning things. He was not alone. There were other men with him, 2 or 3, and a woman in a blue dress who stood close to his side, and there were other townspeople drifting near, the way people drift when they expect something worth watching. Sarah walked toward him. He saw her coming, and something changed in his face. Not surprise exactly, he had known she was on this train, had set this date himself, but something harder. A kind of assessment. The way a man looks at livestock he's considering and finds it wanting before he's even checked its teeth. She stopped 3 feet from him and extended her hand. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I'm Sarah Miller. I'm very glad to finally—" "Miss Miller." His voice was flat. His hands stayed at his sides. "I appreciate you making the journey." The woman in the blue dress looked away. One of the men beside Cole studied the ground. Sarah kept her hand extended for 1 full second, then she lowered it slowly. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "I've had a change of plans. This should cover your return fare and an additional amount for your trouble." He held the envelope out toward her. "There's a train back east on Monday morning. I'd recommend the early departure." The platform had gone very quiet. Sarah did not take the envelope. "A change of plans?" she said. "That's right." "You've had a change of plans since you last wrote to me 3 weeks ago. Circumstances change." She looked at the woman in the blue dress. The woman looked back at her without expression, then glanced at Cole in a way that said everything that Cole himself was too cowardly to say out loud. Sarah understood it all in that moment. Every single piece of it. The late correspondence, the vague language in his last letter. The way he'd never once asked her a specific question about herself, or her preferences, or what she wanted from a life together. Because he'd been making other plans and keeping her as a fallback, an insurance, a contingency he never fully intended to use. She had sold her mother's brooch. She had sold her winter coat. She had ridden 4 days on a train. She looked at the envelope in Richard Cole's hand, and she felt something move through her that was not grief and not rage, but something colder and more precise than either. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when every illusion you've been carrying is stripped away at once, and you see exactly what is true and what is not. "Keep it," she said. "Miss Miller, keep your money, Mr. Cole." She picked up her trunk. "And your plans, and whatever you intend to tell yourself about this when it's done." She turned and walked to the edge of the platform. She heard him say something behind her. Something about common sense and long journeys and the practical reality of her situation. But his voice got smaller very fast, because she was focusing very hard on not letting her legs shake, and they almost didn't. She set her trunk down at the edge of the platform and stood with her back to all of them, to Cole and his woman in the blue dress, and the men who'd watched the whole thing without once stepping forward. And she stared out at Clearwater, Wyoming. One main street, a handful of buildings, mountains in the far distance that looked carved from something permanent and indifferent. She had $23. She had no return ticket. She had nowhere to go. She stood there for a long moment. Then a voice came from somewhere to her left, low and unhurried, with the particular texture of a man who chooses his words carefully because he doesn't have any to waste. "Ma'am?" She turned. He was leaning against the far post of the platform arms, crossed hat pulled low. A man about her age, maybe a few years older, with the kind of face that weather and work had made honest. He wasn't dressed well. He wasn't dressed poorly. He was dressed like a man who didn't think much about what he was wearing because there were more important things to spend thought on. He wasn't looking at Cole. He was looking at her. "You need somewhere to be tonight," he said. "I need a job," she said. Because that was the truth, and she had decided somewhere between Richard Cole's envelope and the edge of this platform that she was done softening the truth to make other people comfortable. He studied her for a moment. Not the way Cole had not, with that quick diminishing assessment, but the way a person looks when they're actually trying to understand something. "Name's Jack Hale," he said. "I run the Hale Ranch about 4 miles north of town. I've got 12 men, a household that's falling apart. And nobody who knows how to manage either one. The work is hard and the hours are long and the pay is $3 a week with room and board." "$3.50, Sarah said. Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't quite call it a smile, but it was close. $3.25, he said. "Done." He pushed off the post and picked up the other end of her trunk without being asked. And that small gesture, the simple, unannounced assumption that helping was the natural thing to do, undid something in Sarah's chest that she hadn't even known was coiled tight. She walked beside him off the platform and down the street toward a wagon she assumed was his, and she did not look back at Richard Cole even once, and she was fiercely, privately proud of that. The wagon ride was mostly quiet. Jack Hale was not a man who filled silence for the sake of it, and Sarah was grateful for that, because she needed the silence to reassemble herself. The shock of the platform was fading, and what was replacing it was something more practical. She was in Wyoming. She had no room. She had no connections, and she had just committed herself to a man she'd met 40 seconds ago based on nothing more than the fact that he'd said ma'am, like he meant it. She thought about that and decided it was probably enough for now. "How long has the household been without management?" she asked eventually. "About a year. Had a woman from town coming in twice a week, but she stopped when her husband took sick." "What's the biggest problem?" He thought about it. "Meals," he said. "Men work better when they eat regular. Right now they eat when there's food, and they're in a mood to find it, which isn't the same thing." "What's the second biggest problem?" "The men themselves, probably. Are they dangerous?" He considered this with a seriousness she appreciated. "Not to a woman who makes it clear from the start that she isn't afraid of them," he said. "Couple of them might test that, but only once." "I've managed rougher," she said. He glanced at her. "Mill work." She hadn't told him about the mill. "How'd you know your hands?" he said simply. Not unkindly, just factually. She looked down at her hands, the calluses along her palms, the particular roughness of fingers that had handled machinery for 15 years, and she felt that old reflex, the impulse to hide them, to fold them in her lap, to apologize for what they said about where she came from, and she made a conscious decision to ignore it. 15 years, she said. He nodded once, like that explained something he'd already suspected, and turned his eyes back to the road. The ranch appeared as the wagon came over a low rise, a main house, a large barn, several outbuildings, fences that needed repair in 2 or 3 places she could already see from a distance. It was not beautiful. It was not picturesque. It was a working property that had been worked very hard and not quite kept up with the way all working properties eventually are, when there aren't enough hours in the day. But it was substantial. It was real. It sat on land that went on in every direction, like it intended to continue indefinitely, and something in Sarah's chest responded to that with a want so immediate it surprised her. She did not say anything about this. The men were coming in from the day's work when the wagon pulled up. 12 of them, as advertised, ranging in age from a boy who couldn't have been more than 17 to a gray-bearded man who looked like he'd been part of this land so long he'd grown into it. They stopped when they saw the wagon. They looked at Sarah. Several of them looked at each other. Jack climbed down from the wagon and set her trunk on the ground and turned to face them without raising his voice. "This is Miss Miller," he said. "She's managing the household starting today. What she says about meals and the house goes. Questions get answered by me." He paused. "Anyone confused about any of that?" Nobody was confused about any of that. He turned back to Sarah. "I'll show you the kitchen and your room. House rules are simple. I'll run through them tonight. Ask me anything you need to ask. There's no question too small if it keeps things running." "Understood," she said. "One more thing." He was looking at her with that same direct, unornamented attention. "What Cole did today on that platform, that was a sorry thing, and it didn't reflect anything about you." He paused. "I want to say that clear, because I doubt anyone else in this town is going to bother." Sarah held very still. In all the years she had worked and waited, and asked for nothing from anyone she could count on one hand, the number of times someone had offered her a simple human courtesy without wanting something in return for it. "Thank you," she said. The words came out steadier than she'd expected. He nodded once. "Let me show you the kitchen." The kitchen was large and neglected and full of potential, and Sarah stood in the middle of it and took inventory the way she always took inventory of a new situation, methodically, practically, with the specific attention of a woman who has learned that the difference between surviving and not surviving is almost always the quality of your first assessment. Cookware that needed cleaning, staples that were adequate but not organized, a stove that appeared functional, a back door that opened onto a vegetable garden that had been left to its own devices for at least one full season, but still had life in it if someone was willing to do the work. She could work with this. She turned around and Jack was still in the doorway watching her. "The men eat at 6, he said. Anything before then, however you need to spend the time, is yours to use. I'll have something ready by 6, she said. You don't have to start tonight. I'll have something ready by 6, she said again, and something in her tone apparently communicated that this was not a discussion, because he simply nodded and stepped back. She made supper that night from what she found. It was not elaborate salt pork and beans and cornbread and strong coffee. Nothing that required praise, but it was hot, and it was ready at 6 o'clock exactly. And she put it on the table and stood back, and watched 12 men sit down and eat without complaint, for the first time in longer than any of them apparently wanted to admit. One of the younger ones, broad through the shoulders with the look of a man who'd decided early that he was the funniest person in any room, looked up halfway through and said, "Not bad for a city woman." "Finish your food," Sarah said without turning around from where she was cleaning the stove. There was a short silence. Then someone else at the table said, "You heard her, Billy." And there was a sound that might have been a smothered laugh from several directions at once. She didn't show what that did to her, but it did something. That night, in her small room at the back of the house, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of the grief she had not permitted herself on the platform, or in the wagon, or in the kitchen. She thought about her mother's brooch sold to a jeweler who'd given her half what it was worth. She thought about the train ticket she had been too proud to keep. She thought about Richard Cole's face and the envelope in his hand, and the way the woman in the blue dress had looked at her. Then she stopped thinking about all of it. She had $23 and a job that paid $3.25 a week and a kitchen that would be hers to run and land outside the window that went on as far as the eye could follow. It was not what she had planned. It was something. She lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, and made herself this one promise: whatever came next, she would earn it. Not on her back, not by charm, not by making herself smaller to fit someone else's idea of what a woman in her situation ought to be. She would earn it the way she had always earned everything in her life, with her hands and her mind and a refusal to quit that had never once let her down, even when it was the only thing she still had left. She fell asleep before the lamp burned out. In the morning, she was up before dawn. By the time the first man stumbled into the kitchen, expecting nothing in particular, there was coffee on the stove and biscuits in the oven, and Sarah Miller standing at the table with a list in her hand and the specific expression of a woman who has figured out exactly where she is and exactly what needs to be done about it. She looked up when he came in. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee's hot." He sat down. The day began. The first week nearly broke her, and she would never admit that to a single living soul. Not because the work was harder than she had expected it to be hard, but because of the particular cruelty of 12 men who had decided collectively and without discussion to see exactly how much she could take before she cracked. It started small. Coffee mugs left on the floor instead of the table. Boots tracked through the kitchen she had scrubbed the night before. Meals eaten in silence, so pointed it was almost theatrical. No one acknowledging the food. No one acknowledging her as though she were a piece of furniture that had appeared one morning and might disappear just as quietly if ignored long enough. Billy Walsh was the worst of them. Not malicious exactly, more like a young man who had learned early that being difficult was the fastest way to get attention, and had never seen any reason to unlearn it. He was 22, strong as an ox, and had apparently appointed himself the official test of Sarah Miller's limits. On the third morning, he pushed his plate away without touching it. "This ain't what I'm used to," he said. Sarah set down the pan she was holding. "What are you used to? Better?" "Better from who?" He didn't have an answer for that because the answer was nobody. There had been no cook before her, and everyone at the table knew it. "Eat the food, Billy," said the gray-bearded man at the end of the table. His name was Clem Hodder, and he had been on the Hale Ranch for 19 years, and he watched everything that happened in that kitchen with the calm patience of a man who has seen enough cycles of foolishness to know how they end. Billy ate the food. That was day 3. On day 5, he knocked a full bucket of water off the porch railing directly onto the clean laundry she had hung that morning. She watched it happen from 6 feet away. She was almost certain it was not an accident. She walked to the railing. She picked up the bucket. She looked at Billy Walsh for a long, steady moment. "Rehang it," she said. He blinked. "What?" "The laundry. Rehang it." "That ain't my job." "You knocked it down. That makes it your job." He looked around at the other men for support. Nobody looked back. Clem was examining something on the horizon with great interest. Two of the others had found urgent tasks in the opposite direction. Billy Walsh rehung the laundry. He did it badly, but he did it. Sarah said nothing about how he did it. She simply waited until he was done, and then redid it herself without comment, which she suspected was considerably more humiliating than if she had complained. She was not wrong. Jack watched all of this. He watched it from a distance, from doorways from the other end of rooms, with an attention that never quite announced itself, but was never fully absent either. He did not intervene. She had not asked him to, and she did not want him to, and she had a strong sense that he understood both of those things without being told. What he did do on this evening of the 5th day was stop in the kitchen doorway on his way in from the barn and say without preamble, "You're doing well." She was elbow deep in dishwater. She didn't turn around. "I'm doing my job." "That's what I mean," he said. She heard him move on down the hall, and she stood there for a moment with her hands in the soapy water, thinking about the particular way he said things direct, unembellished with none of the hedging or softening that men usually applied when they were trying to manage a woman's feelings. And she decided she trusted it precisely because it didn't try to be anything more than what it was. The second week was different. Something shifted in the household, subtle at first, and then less so. It wasn't any single moment, it was accumulated. The meals that were hot and ready every time without fail. The household accounts she had reorganized and presented to Jack on the 8th day line by line, with 3 areas where money was being wasted that she had identified herself without being asked. The way she had quietly, and without announcement, fixed the back porch step that had been broken so long, the men had simply learned to step over it. Clem Hodder was the first to change. He started leaving his mug on the table instead of the floor. Then he started saying thank you at meals quietly to himself almost, but audible, and once Clem did it, 2 more men followed within a day, the way things cascade in a small community when someone with standing decides to set the example. Billy held out until the end of the 2nd week. The moment that broke him was not one Sarah engineered or expected. One of the horses had gotten into the fence line and taken a bad cut on its foreleg, and the ranch hand responsible for it, a quiet young man named Dewey, who was barely 18 and had been on the property less than a month, came into the kitchen, white-faced and shaking, and clearly expecting to be dismissed over it. Sarah sat him down. She poured him coffee. She said, "Tell me what happened from the start and leave nothing out," in the same tone she used for everything, which was the tone of a person who is asking because they intend to solve the problem, not assign blame. She then cleaned and dressed the horse's wound herself, because the only alternative was riding 4 miles into town for a veterinarian, and Dewey's hands were shaking too badly to do it, and there was no one else immediately available. She had watched enough animal care in her years to know what she was doing, and she did it, and the horse was fine. And Dewey looked at her afterward like she had performed some kind of minor miracle. Billy Walsh had watched the whole thing from the barn door. That night at supper, he said without looking at her directly, "That was good work today, Miss Miller." Sarah kept her eyes on the table she was wiping. "Thank you, Billy." And that was that. No ceremony. No acknowledgement of everything that had preceded it. Just the small, ordinary piece of a battle that was over. Jack came to her 3 days later with the household accounts in his hand and an expression she couldn't quite read. "These numbers," he said. "You found this in 1 week. 10 days. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was the first time he had done that, and spread the pages out in front of him. "The feed supplier," he said. "I've used Garland's for 8 years. He's overcharging you by about 30% on the grain. I found another supplier in the next county who can deliver at a better rate." I wrote the name and the figure on the back of that page. Jack turned the page over and looked at what she'd written. He was quiet for a moment. "You went to the trouble of finding this." It's part of the job. It's not what I hired you to do. I manage the household, Sarah said. The household runs on money. Finding ways to spend that money better is part of managing the household. Unless you'd prefer I spend it worse. He looked up at her then, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful assessing attention she'd grown accustomed to, but something quicker and less guarded. He almost laughed. She saw him stop it, but it was close. I'll contact the new supplier, he said. I already wrote him, she said. Letters going out with tomorrow's mail, unless you want to change something. Jack Hale looked at her for a long, quiet moment. I don't want to change anything, he said. He gathered the pages and stood up and was almost at the door when he stopped. He didn't turn around. Cole didn't know what he was sending back, he said. Then he walked out. Sarah stood very still in the kitchen for a moment after that. She picked up the cloth she'd been using and folded it slowly and set it on the counter, and she made herself focus on what needed to be done next, because the alternative was to stand there thinking about what Jack Hale had just said and what she felt about it, and she was not ready to do that yet, not even close. The third week brought trouble of a different order entirely. It came in the form of a man named Dale Pruitt, who arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning with a surveyor's kit and a document folded in his jacket pocket. He tied his horse at the post and walked up to the main house like he owned it, which Sarah would later understand was exactly the manner he intended to project. She was on the porch when he rode up. She had come out to take in the dry goods that had been delivered an hour earlier. Morning, he said. He had the smooth, slightly theatrical courtesy of a man who has practiced being agreeable so long it no longer reaches his eyes. This the Hale property? It is, Sarah said. Jack Hale's out on the North Range. I can send someone for him if you'd like to wait. Pruitt's eyes moved over her in a way she recognized the quick cataloging look that was trying to place her in a category it understood. You the housekeeper. I manage the property, she said. A small adjustment. Deliberate. Something moved behind his eyes. I'll wait for Mr. Hale, he said. She sent Dewey for Jack and put Pruitt in the main room with coffee he didn't ask for and didn't thank her for. And while he waited, she found reasons to be in the adjacent hallway because she had been managing households long enough to know that the things that happened while the important men were talking were almost always more important than the things that happened after. She heard Pruitt stand up the moment Jack's boots hit the porch. Jack came in. She heard the handshake, the exchanged names, the particular vocal register men use when they're pretending a conversation is more casual than it is. Came to talk to you about the Eastern Creek boundary, Pruitt said. There's nothing to talk about on that boundary, Jack said. It's been settled for 12 years. That's a matter of some dispute, actually. There was the sound of the folded document being removed from a jacket. These survey lines were redrawn last spring by the county assessor. The Eastern Creek section 43 acres appears to fall outside your recorded deed. A pause, long enough for Sarah to count 6 heartbeats. Who filed that survey? Jack said. His voice had gone very flat. It was filed by a coalition of property holders along the creek line. There's a meeting scheduled next month to formalize the boundary adjustment. Another pause. I represent those interests, Mr. Hale. I came as a courtesy. You came as a threat, Jack said. And I want you off my property. Pruitt's voice didn't change. That was the most dangerous thing about him. Nothing changed in his voice. I understand this is difficult news. I'd encourage you to look at the documents before you make any decisions you can't take back. Get out, Jack said. She heard Pruitt's boots on the floor. She heard the front door. She stayed very still in the hallway until she heard it close. Then she walked into the main room. Jack was standing at the window holding the document Pruitt had left behind. Because, of course, he had left it behind. That was the whole point. He didn't turn when she came in. How much did you hear? He said. Enough, she said. The Eastern Creekland. How much of your water supply runs through it? He was quiet for a moment. All of it, he said. Every drop of water this ranch depends on comes through that creek section. Sarah looked at the back of his head and at the set of his shoulders. and she understood with sudden precision what this was. This wasn't a boundary dispute. This was a slow strangulation. Take the water, and you don't need to take the land, because the land dies on its own. "Can I see the document?" she said. He turned then, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not guarded, not careful. Raw in a way she suspected he hadn't intended. He held the papers out. She took them. She read through them carefully the way she read everything starting at the beginning and not letting herself skip ahead. The legal language was dense, but she had spent 2 years before the mill doing filing work for a Chicago lawyer, and she knew how to move through a document and find what it was actually saying underneath what it appeared to be saying. 3 pages in, she found it. "This survey," she said. "It was filed in March." "What about it?" "March of this year." "Your deed, do you have your original deed here?" "In the office. Locked box." "Get it," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then went. He came back with a document older and more worn than Pruitt's and laid it on the table. Sarah put them side by side and traced the boundary descriptions with her finger. "The creek boundary in your deed is described by landmark reference," she said. "The cottonwood cluster at the North Fork and the limestone shelf at the southern bend. Both landmarks." She looked up. "If those landmarks still exist, if nothing's moved or been removed, then this new survey is overriding a legal landmark description with a coordinate survey that wasn't filed under proper procedure. You need a land attorney. But I don't think this document can do what they're saying it can do." Jack stared at the papers. He was very still. "How do you know that?" he said. "I worked for a land office in Chicago. Brief, before the mill." She straightened. "It may not matter. I'm not a lawyer. But it's enough to question, and questioning is enough to slow them down. And slowing them down is enough to find someone who knows more than I do." He was looking at her the way he had looked at the household accounts, with that expression she still didn't have a name for, like she was something he was trying to adjust his understanding of. "The nearest land attorney is in Cheyenne," he said. 3 days' ride." "Then you should write him tonight," she said. "Draft the letter, and I'll look at it before it goes out if you want another set of eyes." He was quiet again for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" he said. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked plainly the way he asked everything. Sarah considered the honest answer and decided to give it. "Because it's wrong," she said. "What they're doing is wrong. And I've been in enough situations where something wrong happened and nobody around me thought it was worth the trouble of opposing it." She paused. "I find I no longer have patience for that." Jack looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said finally. He pulled out the chair at the table and sat down. "Let me get paper." They worked on the letter for 2 hours that evening, side by side at the kitchen table, Jack dictating and Sarah shaping the language, tightening it, removing the places where his anger leaked into the phrasing and made it sound like emotion instead of argument. He pushed back on 2 of her changes and she explained why they mattered, and he listened. Actually listened, the way people do when they're more interested in being right than in being seen to be right, and when it was done, they had something that was better than either of them could have produced alone. When Jack read through the final version, he was quiet for a moment. "You're good at this," he said. "I'm good at a lot of things," she said. "I haven't had much occasion to use all of them." He folded the letter. He didn't say anything else, but she noticed getting up from the table that he moved his chair back to give her room to pass, and held the lamp so she could see the doorway clearly. And she thought that for a man who didn't use many words, Jack Hale found a great number of ways to say the things he meant. She was halfway down the hall to her room when she heard Clem Hodder's voice from the bunkhouse low and carrying just enough through the window. "That woman," Clem said to someone she couldn't see, "is not what Cole threw back. Whatever Cole threw back, that ain't what she is." Sarah kept walking, but she carried that the rest of the night. The letter went out the next morning, and Dale Pruitt rode back through the ranch gate that same afternoon with 2 men she hadn't seen before, and he tipped his hat to her where she stood on the porch, and he smiled with everything except his eyes. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast. Dale Pruitt's second visit lasted 11 minutes. Sarah counted, because she was the kind of woman who counted things when she needed to keep herself from saying what she was actually thinking. He came with the two men she hadn't recognized, one carrying a second set of survey documents, one saying nothing and watching everything with the particular stillness of a man paid to make other men uncomfortable. Pruitt himself sat across from Jack at the table in the main room and laid out what he called a reasonable offer, in the tone of a man who has already decided what the outcome will be and is simply performing the courtesy of the negotiation. 30 cents on the acre for the Eastern Creek section. That land is worth $8 an acre on the low end, Jack said. That land, Pruitt said, is currently in legal dispute and will remain so for however long it takes the county to finalize the boundary assessment, which could be a year, could be longer. During which time, Mr. Hale, your access to that water is not guaranteed. He spread his hands in a gesture of theatrical reasonableness. I'm offering you certainty. You're offering me theft with a handshake, Jack said. Pruitt smiled. I'd encourage you to speak with an attorney before you make your final decision. I already have, Jack said. That wasn't entirely true. Yet the letter to the Cheyenne attorney had gone out only yesterday, but Sarah, standing in the hallway, felt a quiet satisfaction at the way Jack said it. Flat and final, no hesitation. The voice of a man who has already decided what he believes and is not interested in being talked out of it. Pruitt left at 11 minutes. The silent man watched Sarah as he walked past her in the hallway. She looked back at him with an expression she had spent 31 years perfecting, the one that communicated clearly that she was paying attention and was not afraid. And he looked away first. When they were gone, Jack came to stand in the hallway. He didn't say anything for a moment. They're not going to stop, Sarah said. No. They came back this fast because they expected you to be shaken. They wanted to see it. Did they see it? She looked at him. No, she said. They didn't. He nodded slow and once, and she saw in his face the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding a very heavy thing up for a very long time and has simply decided to keep holding it because there is no alternative. That night after supper, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet, Jack brought 2 cups of coffee to the table without asking if she wanted any and set one in front of her chair and sat down across from it. She sat. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. I have a brother, he said. Younger. Name's Thomas. He's been gone from this property for 4 years, left after our father died, and the ranch came to me and not to him. He turned the cup in his hands. He's been in contact with Pruitt. Sarah was very still. How do you know? Got a letter this morning, from Thomas. He says he's retained legal representation and intends to contest the inheritance on grounds that our father's will was signed under duress. He paused. Which is not true. But it doesn't have to be true to tie this ranch up in court for long enough to make the water dispute fatal. So they're working together, Sarah said. It appears that way. Does Thomas want the ranch? Jack was quiet for a moment. Thomas wants to hurt me, he said. Not with self-pity. Just as a fact he'd had a long time to come to terms with. The ranch is the means to that. If Pruitt gets the water rights and Thomas ties up the deed, the ranch is dead inside of 18 months. They don't even have to win outright. They just have to drag it long enough. How long do you have before Thomas can file? 30 days. Maybe 40 if the circuit court is backed up. He looked at her. The Cheyenne lawyer is my best option. But Cheyenne is 3 days out, and even if he takes the case legal work, costs money this ranch does not currently have in reserve. The word reserve landed in the room and stayed there. Sarah made herself not react to it. Not yet. How much would you need? She said carefully. More than I have. He said it simply without shame, and she respected that. The spring cattle drive should have covered it, but we lost 8 head to rustlers last month, and the price at market was low. I've been managing close to the edge for most of this year. She picked up her coffee and held it and looked at the grain of the table and made some decisions she wasn't ready to announce yet. Write the lawyer again tonight, she said. Tell him the situation has escalated. Tell him about Thomas, and tell him you need to know if there's any legal mechanism to delay Thomas's filing until your water dispute case is entered. You think there is? I think a good lawyer will find one if it exists, and I think you need to know what you're working with before you decide what you can afford. He looked at her. You're doing it again, he said. Doing what? Thinking 3 steps ahead of the problem. Someone has to, she said. Something moved across his face that she was starting to recognize now, that almost smile that never quite arrived, the one that happened when she said something that surprised him out of his usual gravity. Get some sleep, she said. Write the letter in the morning when you're thinking clearly. Tonight you're tired, and tired men make bad decisions. He almost argued. She could see it in the way he drew breath. Then he let it out. You're right, he said. I usually am, she said. Good night, Mr. Hale. Jack, he said, quiet, almost like he hadn't intended to say it out loud. She looked at him. It's Jack, he said. You've been here 3 weeks. I think we're past the formal address. She considered this for a moment. Good night, Jack, she said. She carried that all the way down the hall to her room, and she did not examine it too closely because she had made a rule for herself about him, and the rule was that she was here to work, and she intended to keep working, and anything else was a complication she could not afford. She had enough complications. She had more than enough, but she lay awake longer than usual that night. The trouble came without warning on a Thursday, 6 days after Pruitt's second visit. Jack and 5 of the men had gone out to the North Range to deal with a fence that had come down in a bad wind the night before. Clem had driven into town for supplies. That left Sarah at the house with Billy Dewey and 2 other hands who were working the near pasture. She was in the kitchen when she heard the front door. Not a knock. The door simply opened the way a door opens when the person opening it has decided they don't need to knock. She came out of the kitchen and into the hall and stopped. 2 men stood inside the front door. Not the ones who had come with Pruitt. Different men, rougher, with the particular look of men hired for tasks that required more muscle than judgment. One was broad across the chest and holding his hat in a way that was almost polite but not quite. The other had his thumbs hooked in his belt and was looking around the house like he was taking an inventory he hadn't been invited to take. Can I help you? Sarah said. She kept her voice level. She kept her feet. We're looking for Hale, the broad one said. Mr. Hale is not here. If you'd like to leave your name, I'll let him know you came by. Maybe we'll wait, the other one said. He was looking at the sideboard against the wall at the small items on it. The lamp, the framed paper, a tin box she used for household receipts. You can wait on the porch, Sarah said. The broad one looked at her then. Really looked the way men look when they're deciding whether someone is worth the trouble of listening to. We'll wait inside, he said. If it's all the same to you. It isn't all the same to me, Sarah said. This is private property. You came in without invitation, and you can leave the same way. Neither man moved. The one with his thumbs in his belt took a step toward the sideboard. Sarah turned and walked back into the kitchen. Not away. She walked with purpose the way she walked everywhere, and she heard one of them say something to the other in a low voice that was not meant for her. She reached the far wall of the kitchen. She reached up. She took down the shotgun that Jack had shown her the location of in her first week, explaining where it was with the same matter-of-fact practicality with which he explained everything, and she checked that it was loaded. It was because Jack Hale was the kind of man who kept things ready, and she walked back into the hallway. Both men had moved further inside. They both stopped when she came around the corner. I asked you to leave, she said. She did not raise the gun. She held it with the barrel angled toward the floor, and her hands quiet and her feet shoulder-width apart the way she had watched men stand when they meant what they were saying. I'm only going to ask once more. The broad one stared at her. Lady, he started. Once more, she said. They left. She stood in the hallway and listened to their horses leave the property at a pace that told her they were not interested in testing her sincerity. And she stood there until she could no longer hear hoofbeats. And then she leaned against the wall, because her legs had decided this was an appropriate time to remember they were made of something human. She straightened before Dewey came in from the pasture. She had the shotgun back on the wall, and supper started before Billy Walsh found her in the kitchen 20 minutes later because apparently Dewey had seen the strange horses leaving at speed and told the others. "What happened?" Billy said. "We had unwanted visitors," she said. "It's handled." Billy stared at her. He had the expression of a young man whose understanding of a situation has just been forcibly and permanently reorganized. "Did you—" "Supper is in 2 hours," Sarah said. "If you want to make yourself useful, the woodpile needs restocking." Billy Walsh restocked the woodpile without another word. Jack came back at dusk. Dewey met him at the gate. She saw that from the window, the quick, urgent conversation, Jack's head turning toward the house before Dewey was even finished talking. He came inside, fast boots loud on the porch, and came to the kitchen doorway and took her in with a long look that started at her face and went to her hands and then back to her face. "You're all right," he said. "I'm fine." Dewey said there were 2 men. There were. "And you?" "Ask them to leave," she said, twice. They left. He was very still in the doorway. She kept her attention on the pot in front of her because looking at him directly right now felt like something she couldn't afford. "Sarah," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. And it carried more weight than those 2 words usually carry, the way certain words do when the person saying them means more than the word itself can hold. "It's my home," she said. She heard herself say it. She felt the truth of it arrive 1 full second after the words were already out. Jack heard it too. She could tell by the way he went very still. "I mean," she started. "I know what you mean," he said, quietly, not pressing it, giving her the room to let the word stand on its own without making it a bigger thing than she was ready for. She turned back to the stove. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, and then she heard him move on. The letter from the Cheyenne attorney arrived 4 days later. She was the one who collected the mail because Jack was out. She recognized the law office seal on the envelope and brought it inside and left it on the table and made herself not hold it up to the light because there were limits to a woman's composure, and she had nearly reached hers. When Jack read it that evening, his expression did not change, which was the thing that frightened her most about it. "What does he say?" she asked. Jack laid the letter flat on the table. "He says the case is arguable. He says the landmark boundary description in my deed is a defensible position, but not a guaranteed one. He says it will take a minimum of 3 months to build a proper case, during which the water access question will remain open." He paused. "And he says his retainer is $200. The number sat on the table between them like something with weight. "And Thomas's filing," she said. The attorney found one procedural ground to delay it, 30 days, maybe 40. He looked at her. "Which is almost exactly how long we have before this becomes something I cannot come back from." Sarah looked at the letter. She thought about what she had written 2 weeks ago to a lawyer in Chicago. A different letter, a different matter entirely, one she had told herself was only preliminary and probably unnecessary, and was almost certainly not going to amount to anything. She had not told Jack about that letter. She had not told him about the other thing she had not told him yet, which was that her mother, who had been a quieter and more careful woman than anyone who knew her would have guessed, had spent 40 years putting aside small amounts in a bank account that Sarah had discovered only after her death, and that currently held $412 more than enough to cover the attorney's retainer and leave something besides. She had not touched that money. She had not touched it because touching it meant making a decision that she had been telling herself was still hypothetical. That what she felt about this ranch, and about the man who owned it, was still temporary. Still something she could step back from without loss. She had made a rule, and the rule had been protection, and breaking it meant admitting that what she was protecting herself from had already happened. She looked at Jack Hale across the table, at the exhaustion held precisely in check behind his eyes, at the set of his jaw, at the way his hands rested flat on the table, because they had nowhere else to go. And she thought about the platform in Clearwater, and the return ticket in the dirt, and the $23 pinned inside her dress, and every morning she had gotten up before dawn, and every problem she had solved that wasn't technically hers to solve. And every moment she had said, "This is my home," and meant it more than the last time. "Give me a few days," she said. He looked at her. "Sarah, 3 days," she said. "Don't do anything, don't write anything, don't decide anything. Give me 3 days." He studied her face for a long time, and she held his gaze because she owed him that. "3 days," he said. Then from outside, rapid hoofbeats hit the gate, and Dewey's voice came through the dark, sharp, and wrong and high, with something that was not excitement. Jack was on his feet before the sound stopped. Sarah was right behind him. Dewey was bleeding from a cut above his ear, and his horse was lathered white, and he was talking before he even got fully off the saddle. "They hit the south fence line," he said. 4 of them, maybe 5, ran off at least 30 head and cut the wire in 3 places. Clem went after them, but his horse threw a shoe 2 miles out and he's on foot." He grabbed Jack's arm. "There's more, Jack. One of them, I recognized him. That big one who came to the house last week. The one Miss Miller ran off." Jack turned to look at Sarah. She was already thinking. "They waited for you to be away from the North Range," she said. "They know your patrol pattern." "Someone's been watching us," Jack said. "Someone's been watching for a while." She turned to Dewey. "How bad is the cut?" "It ain't bad. I'm fine." "Sit down. You're not fine." She steered him to the porch steps by the shoulder and pressed the cloth she'd had in her apron pocket against his head, and she looked at Jack over Dewey's bent head. "Go. Take Billy and whoever else is saddled. I'll get Dewey cleaned up and send someone for Clem. I don't want to leave the house undefended." "The house is not undefended," she said. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, she saw him make a decision that was not tactical, but personal, the particular look of a man deciding to trust someone completely with something he values. "Lock the back door," he said. "Already planning to," she said. He went. Within 4 minutes, the yard was empty of horses, and the sound of hoofbeats was fading south, and Sarah had Dewey's cut cleaned and closed, and was sending young Eli, the 17-year-old, the youngest hand, the one with legs that still ran faster than he knew what to do with on foot, to find Clem Hodder on the south road. Then she went inside and got the shotgun off the wall. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and waited, which was the hardest thing she had done since she arrived in Wyoming. Waiting had always been the hardest thing. Harder than working harder than going without. Harder than the particular loneliness of a woman who has been self-sufficient for so long that needing someone feels like a character flaw. Waiting meant there was nothing left to do with your hands, nothing left to solve or manage or improve. And in the silence, all the things you had been keeping yourself too busy to think about came and sat down across from you and looked you in the face. She thought about the $412. She thought about the decision she had already made, the one she had been calling hypothetical for days now, the one that had stopped being hypothetical somewhere around the moment. She said, "This is my home," out loud without planning to. She thought about what it meant to choose something, not because you had no other option, but because you wanted it. Because it was worth wanting. She had spent so many years making choices from the narrow end of necessity. You take the mill job because the alternatives are worse. You answer the advertisement because the alternative is watching your life get smaller until there's nothing left of it that she had almost forgotten what a choice made from want felt like. Whether she even trusted herself to recognize it. She was still sitting with all of this when she heard the footstep on the back porch. Not a horse, not hoofbeats. Just the single weighted creak of a board under a boot, deliberate and slow. The sound of someone who has decided to approach quietly and believes they have succeeded. Sarah stood up from the table. She did not make a sound. She moved to the side of the back door and put her back to the wall and held the shotgun across her chest and breathed slowly through her nose, the way she used to breathe during the bad moments at the mill. The gear failures, the fires, the times when panic was a luxury no one could afford. And she waited. The door handle moved. She had locked it. The handle moved against the lock and stopped, and there was a pause, a thinking pause, a reassessing pause, and then a sound she recognized as a knife blade working the doorframe. These were not men who had come to talk. The door opened. The first man through was the broad one, the same one who had stood in her hallway 10 days ago. The same one whose decision to leave she had facilitated with the shotgun at her side. He stepped into the kitchen, and he had a gun in his hand, and he turned to the right, because that was the natural direction to turn when you came in, and she was on the left. "Stop," she said. He spun. She was 3 feet from him, with the shotgun leveled, and her hands completely steady, because she had decided before she heard the footstep that she was not going to let them shake. He froze. "Put it down," she said. "Lady, put the gun on the floor right now," she said. "Do not make me say it again." He put it on the floor. The second man appeared in the doorway behind him. He saw her. He stopped. "Him too," Sarah said. "Whatever he's holding, on the floor." The second man was slower about it. She waited him out with the patience of someone who has already decided she has nothing left to be afraid of, and he eventually put a knife on the floor that he'd been holding below the doorframe where she couldn't see it. "Now sit down," she said. "Both of you. At the table." They sat. She moved to put the table between herself and the back door, keeping both men in front of her, the shotgun steady. "Who sent you?" Neither man spoke. "I have more patience than you do," she said. "I have been patient my entire life. You came into this house twice now without invitation. The second time you came armed and through a locked door. When the sheriff gets here, what you tell him about who sent you will make the difference between a fine and a prison sentence." She paused. "I'd think carefully about which one you prefer." The broad man looked at his companion. Something passed between them. "Pruitt," the broad one said. "He hired us to come take whatever papers Hale had on the property, any documents about the deed or the water survey. And if someone was here—" A pause. "We were told the house would be empty." "Pruitt told you that?" "Yes, ma'am." Sarah looked at them for a long moment. She was thinking about the documents, Jack's original deed, the survey papers, the copy of the Cheyenne attorney's letter, all of which were in the locked box in the office. Which meant Pruitt knew about the documents, which meant Pruitt knew about the attorney, which meant someone had seen or heard more than they should have. "You're going to wait right there," she said, "until the sheriff arrives. And you're going to tell him exactly what you just told me. Both of you." The broad man looked up at her. "Pruitt has pull with the county sheriff. Then you'll tell it to a federal marshal," she said. "Because what you just described to me is coordinated property fraud and criminal trespass, and that crosses into federal jurisdiction. Dale Pruitt's local connections won't help him much with a federal charge." She had heard that from the Chicago land lawyer years ago, had filed the case documents herself, and she was fairly certain it still applied. And even if it didn't quite apply, these two men didn't know that. They stayed at the table. She stayed with the shotgun until she heard horses in the yard. Jack's horses, Jack's men, and the particular cadence of Jack's voice calling her name as he came through the front. She found her voice. "Kitchen," she called back. He came through the doorway and took in the scene, 2 men at the table, her with the shotgun, everything intact, and he was still for a moment in a way that reminded her of how still water gets just before something moves underneath it. "They came for the documents," she said. "Pruitt sent them. They've confirmed it. We need the sheriff." Jack looked at the broad man. The broad man looked at the table. "Billy?" Jack called toward the front of the house. Billy Walsh appeared in the doorway. He looked at the 2 men. He looked at Sarah. His expression did several complicated things in rapid succession. "Ride for the sheriff," Jack said. "Tell him we have 2 men in custody, and Pruitt's name to go with them." Billy went without a word. Jack looked at Sarah. She lowered the shotgun for the first time since she had raised it, and she became aware as she did that her arms ached from holding the same position for what must have been close to 40 minutes. She set it on the counter and pressed her palms flat to the surface and breathed. Jack crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and stood beside her. Not in front of her, beside her at her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without him touching her. "Are you hurt?" he said, low, just for her. No. Sarah. I'm not hurt, she said. I'm angry. She looked at him. They knew about the attorney. They knew about the documents. Pruitt has someone close to this property giving him information. Jack's jaw tightened. Agreed. It's not one of your men, she said. I'd stake anything on that. It's someone in town. Someone Pruitt pays to watch and report. He nodded slowly. Garland, he said. The feed supplier. He delivers to the property twice a month. He'd hear enough. And I just told him last week we were changing suppliers. His voice was very flat. He'd have reason to cooperate with Pruitt on top of whatever Pruitt's paying him. It fit. It fit the way things fit when the pieces had been there all along and you just needed the right angle to see them connect. Tell the sheriff that too, she said. He was watching her face. She could feel it even when she wasn't looking at him. You held this house alone, he said. The house needed holding. I know. He paused. That's not what I mean. She looked at him then. I mean, he said carefully, that you didn't have to be here. You could have gone out the front with Eli and stayed clear of whatever happened. Nobody would have blamed you for that. It was the sensible thing. Yes, she said. It was. But you stayed. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. I did. He looked at her for a long moment. She saw him working toward something. She could feel the weight of it, the same weight she had been feeling for days on her own side, of the same silence. And then Clem Hodder came through the back door, with mud on his boots and his hat missing, and the energy of a man who has walked 3 miles and has things to report, and the moment broke cleanly in half. She turned to Clem. The sheriff arrived 2 hours later. He was a solid man named Garrett, who listened more than he talked, and wrote everything down with a pencil that he kept extremely sharp, and when Sarah told him about Pruitt's name and what the 2 men had confirmed, he wrote that down too, without the expression of a man who doubted it. When she mentioned the federal jurisdiction question, his pencil stopped. Where'd you come across that? He said. I worked for a land law office in Chicago, she said. Water rights fraud that crosses county lines and involves coordinated document theft, that's not just a local matter. Sheriff Garrett looked at her for a moment, and she recognized the look. It was the same look Jack had given her over the household accounts. The look that meant the situation was not matching the prior expectation. He turned to Jack. She right? She usually is, Jack said. Garrett wrote something. I'll be wiring the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne tomorrow morning, he said. In the meantime, these 2 are coming with me, and I want a written statement from the woman about what was said. He looked at Sarah. That means you, ma'am. I know, she said. I'll have it ready in an hour. She wrote the statement at the kitchen table while the men talked on the porch. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, precisely with detail, leaving out nothing that was relevant, and nothing that could be misread, the way she had learned to write documents in the Chicago office when she was barely 20 years old, and trying to prove she was worth the desk they had given her. When she was done, she handed it to Sheriff Garrett, and he read it straight through without interruption, and at the end, he looked up at her. This is good, he said. Thank you, she said. You should have been a lawyer, he said. I know, she said. I was a mill worker instead. He took the statement and his prisoners and left. The night settled back down over the ranch like something breathing. The men drifted to the bunkhouse. Clem stayed long enough to get coffee and tell Sarah 3 times that what she had done was something, and each time she redirected him until he gave up and went to bed. Jack came into the kitchen when it was finally quiet. He sat down across from her. He had the look of a man at the end of a very long day that had turned out differently than expected, and not entirely in the bad direction. The federal question, he said. Do you really think that holds? I think it holds enough to scare Pruitt, she said, and frightened men make mistakes. She paused. I think when the sheriff's wire reaches Cheyenne, whoever Pruitt has there is going to start distancing themselves from him very quickly. That's how it works. When it goes federal, everyone who was providing local cover suddenly remembers they don't know anything. And Thomas, She folded her hands on the table. Thomas is going to hear about tonight. He's going to hear that his partner tried to break into this property and is now in a cell and being handed to federal attention. And then Thomas is going to have to decide whether he wants to be part of that or whether he wants to find a different path. Thomas doesn't scare easy, Jack said. Thomas wants to hurt you, she said, not go to prison. There's a difference. She met his eyes. Give him the chance to walk away. Write him a letter, not an attorney's letter. Your words. Tell him the legal situation. Tell him what Pruitt has brought down and give him a door. She paused. If he takes it, you've solved half your problem without a courtroom. If he doesn't take it, you've still shown the federal marshal that you attempted resolution. That matters. Jack sat with that for a moment. You've thought about this, he said. I've thought about nothing else for 3 days, she said. He looked at her hands on the table, then at her face. Then he said quietly, Tell me about the 3 days. She had known it was coming. She had known since she said, Give me 3 days, that it would come back to this moment, and she had spent all of those 3 days preparing what she was going to say. And now that the moment was here, every careful preparation she had made felt thin. My mother left money, she said, when she died. I didn't know about it until after. She'd been saving for 40 years a little at a time, nothing that would be noticed, and there's $412 in a Chicago bank account that is mine. She held his gaze. It's enough to cover the attorney's retainer, enough to cover the filing fees for your deed defense, enough to leave something beside. Jack went very still. Sarah, I'm not finished, she said. I know what you're going to say, that it's too much, that you can't accept it, that it wouldn't be right. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not offering it as charity, and I'm not offering it as a loan. I'm offering it as a stake. She paused. I want a legal interest in this property, a documented partnership share, not a gift, not a favor, a business arrangement that puts my name on paper beside yours. The silence that followed was the longest of her time in Wyoming. You'd be tying yourself to this fight, he said finally, to everything that comes with it. Thomas, Pruitt, the federal case, all of it. I know what I'd be tying myself to, she said. Do you? His voice was very quiet. Because once that paper is signed, there's no clean way out. This becomes yours as much as mine. Every problem that comes after, Jack. She said his name the way he had said hers on the platform, not as a stop, but as a signal. I stood in that kitchen tonight with a shotgun for 40 minutes alone because this felt like mine before I had any legal right to it. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking to make it mine. I'm asking you to make the paper match what it already is. He looked at her for a very long time, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the almost smile, not the careful attention, not the guarded warmth. Something deeper and more fundamental. The particular expression of a man who has been bracing for a long time and has just realized he can stop. I'll have the attorney draw up the partnership agreement, he said, when he comes from Cheyenne. She exhaled slowly. All right, Sarah. He said her name the way you say something you've been holding carefully for a long time. Whatever happens with Thomas and Pruitt, however this goes, I need you to know something. She waited. I didn't bring you out to this ranch because I needed a housekeeper, he said. I saw you on that platform, and you were the most... He stopped. Tried again. I thought about what I was going to say next for 3 weeks, and I still haven't got it right. Say it wrong then, she said. I'll understand. He looked at his hands, then at her. I didn't want you to leave, he said. That first day, before I knew anything about you, except that you threw that return ticket in the dirt and held your head up while Cole walked away. I didn't want you to leave, and I made up a job to give you a reason to stay, and I have not been entirely honest with myself about that until right now. The kitchen was very quiet. Jack, she said softly, I know it complicates... It doesn't, she said. It doesn't complicate anything. He looked at her. It actually, she said carefully. Makes everything simpler. Outside, the wind moved across the Wyoming dark, and somewhere on the South Range, the cattle that had been brought back stood quiet in the recovered night, and the Hale Ranch held its ground the same way it always had, stubbornly, honestly, with more at stake than it had ever had before. The letter to Thomas went out the next morning. Jack wrote it himself at the kitchen table with Sarah across from him drinking coffee and not watching him write, because she understood that some things require privacy, even when you're not alone. He wrote 3 drafts. She heard him crumple the first 2. The third one he folded without reading back through it, which she recognized as the behavior of a man who has finally said the true thing and doesn't want to talk himself out of it. Done, he said. Good, she said. He looked at her across the table. I said things in it I haven't said to him in 12 years. That's why it'll work, she said. He wasn't sure about that. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, but he sealed the letter and gave it to Eli to post, and that was that. The thing was done and out of his hands, which was sometimes the only mercy available. The federal marshal's response to Sheriff Garrett's wire arrived in 4 days. His name was Calloway, and he was coming from Cheyenne, and he would arrive within the week. Garrett rode out to tell Jack personally, which told Sarah something about how seriously Calloway's office was taking the matter, because sheriffs did not typically make personal rides when news could travel by post. Pruitt know yet? Jack asked. Word travels in this county, Garrett said. He knows by now. How's he taking it? Garrett's expression was the careful neutral of a man who has opinions he's choosing not to express officially. His attorney filed 2 motions yesterday, both of them defensive. He paused. Men don't file defensive motions when they think they're winning. After Garrett left, Sarah stood on the porch and let herself feel for exactly 1 careful minute the particular relief of a tide beginning to turn. Then she went back inside because there was still work to do, and relief was not the same as resolution, and she knew better than to mistake one for the other. The marshal arrived on a Wednesday. Calloway was not what she expected. She had built a picture in her mind of someone large and official and intimidating, and what arrived was a lean man of about 50, with a quiet voice and eyes that had the quality of recording everything they landed on permanently. He shook Jack's hand, and he shook Sarah's hand with the same weight which she noticed, and he sat at the kitchen table and asked his questions in order methodically, the way she approached every problem herself, and she respected him immediately for it. He asked her about the night of the break-in. He asked about the 2 men's statement. He asked about Pruitt's visits, about the survey documents, about the timeline of everything going back to the first day Dale Pruitt had ridden onto this property. She told him all of it, precise, sequential, with dates where she had them, which was most of them because she had been keeping notes in a small book since the 2nd week. Not because she'd anticipated this moment, but because keeping notes was simply what she did. When she produced the notebook, Calloway looked at it and then at her. You kept a record, he said. I keep records of everything, she said. Household accounts, supply deliveries, correspondence dates. She slid the notebook across. The relevant entries are marked. He read through the marked pages. Jack sat to her left and said nothing, which she understood was because there was nothing to add. Ma'am, Calloway said finally. This is about the cleanest documentation I've seen come into a case like this in 15 years. Thank you, she said. Where'd you learn to do this? Land law office in Chicago, she said. And a mill. And 31 years of being a woman who knew that if she didn't write things down, no one else would. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Then he closed the notebook and set it on the table. I'm going to need to keep this as evidence. I'll give you a receipt. I expected that, she said. There's a copy. Jack turned to look at her. I made a copy last week, she said without particular emphasis. When things started moving quickly, it's in the lockbox with your deed. He stared at her. You made a copy, he said. I made a copy, she said. Something moved across his face that was not the almost smile and not the careful attention, something wider and less guarded, and she turned back to Calloway before she let herself look at it too long. Calloway took a formal statement from both of them and rode back toward town with the notebook and the names of the two men who were still in Garrett's custody, and a copy of the survey documents that he said would be reviewed by the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne. When he was gone, Jack turned to her in the yard. "A copy," he said again. "Stop," she said, but she was fighting something in her own expression, and they both knew it. "You copied the entire notebook," he said, "in your own time, without telling me. I didn't want to worry you if it turned out not to be necessary. Sarah?" "Don't make it a thing," she said. "It's already a thing," he said. And this time, the almost smile arrived all the way fully and without apology, and she saw it for the first time complete, and it did something to her chest that she categorically refused to analyze while standing in the yard in daylight. She went inside. He followed her, still almost smiling, and the morning continued. Thomas's response came on a Thursday, 9 days after Jack's letter had gone out. Sarah was in the kitchen when Jack came in from the post with it. She knew what it was from the way he was holding it, not carefully, the way men hold things that frighten them, but flatly the way they hold things they are still deciding about. He sat down at the table. She put coffee in front of him and sat across. He opened it. She watched his face while he read because his face was where the truth lived. She watched it move through things, something tightening around his eyes at the beginning, then shifting something harder and less readable in the middle, and then at the end, a long stillness that she couldn't quite name, but that did not look like devastation. He set the letter on the table. She waited. "He's withdrawing the challenge," Jack said. She kept her expression steady. And he says," Jack paused. He looked at the letter again, then back at her. "He says he knew it wasn't right, what he was doing. He says he knew from the moment he signed on with Pruitt that it wasn't right, and that he did it anyway because he was angry, and because being angry was easier than being honest about why he left." He stopped. "He says he's sorry." The kitchen was very quiet. "Do you believe him?" she said. Jack thought about it. Really thought the way he did everything. "I believe that he's afraid," he said. "The federal case scared him. Pruitt cutting him loose probably scared him more." He turned the letter in his hands. "But I think there's something true in it too. I think the apology is real, even if the timing of it is convenient." "That's enough to work with," she said. He looked up. "It's not forgiveness," she said, "and it's not trust, but it's a place to start if you want to start." She held his gaze. "Do you want to?" A long moment. "He's my brother," Jack said. "I know," she said. "That doesn't mean everything's fixed." "I know that too." He folded the letter. He put it in his shirt pocket, close the way you put things you aren't finished with yet. "I'll write him back," he said. "Not today, but soon." "Good," she said. He looked at her with that expression. She had finally stopped pretending she didn't recognize the one that was not assessment or analysis, or the careful attention of an employer watching a competent employee. It was the look of a man who sees someone and does not want to stop seeing them. "I have something to tell you," he said. She waited. "The attorney is coming from Cheyenne next week to draw up the deed defense filing and the partnership agreement." He paused. "I told him to expedite the partnership papers, that they were the priority." She was still. "The deed defense is the more urgent legal matter," she said carefully. "The deed defense can wait 3 days," he said. "The partnership papers can't." "Why not?" He looked at her directly. "Because until your name is on that document, you have no legal standing in any of this. Everything you've done, the records, the statement, the evidence, it all sits better with Calloway's office if you have a documented stake in this property." He paused. "And because I've been meaning to make it right since the moment you told me this was your home." The word landed in the room the same way it had landed the first time she said it. "Jack, I'm not finished," he said with the particular firmness of a man borrowing her own method back at her. "I also want to say that the arrangement I'm asking you to sign is not only a business arrangement. I understand that's what you called it. I know why you called it that. But I want you to know that when I look at those papers, That's not what I see." She held herself very still. "What do you see?" she said. "I see someone who chose this," he said. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Not because the options ran out. She chose it. She walked in here with $23 and her dignity, and she chose every single day to stay and fight for something she didn't have to fight for. He leaned forward slightly. "I want to be worth that choice. I intend to spend a considerable amount of time making sure I am." The thing she had been keeping carefully managed in her chest for 5 weeks came loose all at once. Not catastrophically, she was not a woman given to catastrophe, but completely the way a knot releases when you finally pull the right end. "You already are," she said, quietly. The truth of it so simple, it barely needed saying. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. They sat like that for a moment, just that. Just the fact of it, no further words needed, and the kitchen held them in its practical, unromantic light, the same kitchen where she had made her first meal, and held a shotgun, and written a statement, and copied a notebook, and made every decision that had led to this particular moment. She would not have changed a single one. Dale Pruitt was indicted by the Federal Land Office 6 weeks later on charges of coordinated deed fraud, criminal trespass, and conspiracy to interfere with water rights, a charge that carried the weight of federal statute and did not care about his local connections or the 2 county officials whose palms he had been keeping comfortable for the better part of 3 years. Those officials were named in the investigation as well. The county assessor who had redrawn the survey lines resigned his position on a Thursday morning before anyone could formally ask him to. Garland, the feed supplier, who had been passing information to Pruitt in exchange for guaranteed contracts, lost his license to operate in the county. He left Clearwater before the month was out. The 2 men who had broken into the house took a deal with the federal marshal and testified against Pruitt in exchange for reduced charges. Their testimony, combined with Sarah's documented record and Calloway's 15-page investigative summary, was more than enough. Sarah learned all of this in the way most of it came in pieces over days, the way justice usually arrives, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow accumulation of consequences catching up to a man who had believed himself too clever for them. The attorney from Cheyenne, a careful man named Horace Webb, arrived on a Tuesday and spent 2 days going through the deed documents with the kind of attention that cost a significant amount per hour and was worth every cent. He confirmed what Sarah had suspected, that the landmark boundary description in Jack's original deed superseded the coordinate survey, particularly given the procedural irregularities in how the new survey had been filed. The Eastern Creek section and every drop of water that moved through it remained Hale land. Webb drew up the partnership agreement on the second afternoon. It was 12 pages. Sarah read every one. She asked 4 questions. Webb answered 3 of them immediately and took a half hour on the 4th, which told her the 4th question was the right one to have asked. She signed it. Jack signed it across from her. Webb signed as witness. It was done in less ceremony than she might have imagined. Just 3 people at a table and a pen, and the scratch of ink on paper. And yet when she set the pen down, something settled in her that had not been settled since she stepped off a train in Wyoming with $23 and a decision she hadn't finished making yet. She had finished making it now. That evening, Clem Hodder made some kind of announcement at the supper table that involved the word partnership and caused Billy Walsh to stand up and begin talking very loudly about something she couldn't quite follow. And Dewey tipped his chair back too far and nearly fell off it, and the kitchen was louder than it had ever been, and she stood at the stove with her back to all of them and let herself smile where no one could see it. Jack appeared at her shoulder. "They're happy," he said. "They're ridiculous," she said. "Same thing usually." She turned around. The men were still carrying on. Clem had produced something from somewhere that was definitely not coffee, and Jack was standing close and looking at her with everything he'd stopped trying to keep off his face. "Mine," he said. The word arrived quietly, without theater, without the weight of a declaration. Just a word. Just the truest, simplest thing he could find. She understood it completely. Not possession, not claim in the old sense, not the sense that Richard Cole had implied that day on the platform when he'd sent her back like something that hadn't suited him. Not ownership of a person, but belonging. The particular belonging that goes both directions at once, the kind that only happens when two people have looked at each other clearly in full daylight with no illusions left to hide behind, and decided, yes, this, you. Mine, she said back, and meant the ranch and the fight they had won and the work still ahead, and the man standing close enough that she could feel him breathing, and all of it. Everything, the whole improbable fact of a life she had chosen for herself, out of the ruins of one that had been taken from her. She had come to Wyoming with a trunk and $23 and a letter from a man who hadn't wanted her. She was staying because of a man who had seen her on a platform and made up a job just to give her a reason to. She was staying because of land that had recognized her before she recognized herself. She was staying because she had fought for this place and written its records and held it with her own hands on a night when it needed holding, and there was nothing on this earth, no train, no ticket, no man with an envelope that was ever going to be able to send her back. Sarah Miller had come to Wyoming looking for somewhere to belong. She had found something better. She had become someone who knew exactly where she stood and chose to stand there every single day because it was hers, and she had earned every inch of it.